beautiful face pretty soon. But while you're doing that, let's get into the conversation. George, thank you so much for doing this evening. I am delighted to speak with you. As I told you earlier, your book touched my soul. It was very authentic. It was very personal. It was raw. And, you know, I just want to celebrate your Black joy, your Black boy joy, because I think the world needs to know about this book. I think it's such a testament to who you are. And it's going to be so helpful for young Black males who are struggling with identity. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. So let's get into this really quickly. So George, why did you write this book? Like, what was the calling card for you to do this?
Yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't birthed out of something like beautiful. It was, what I kept seeing was like the tragic killing of young Black gay boys in particular. One of them's name was Giovanni Melton, and I believe he was killed by his father in like November of 2017. And I just remember reading the article about it, and one of the quotes in the newspaper said that one of the things his father stated during the interrogation was that he would rather have a dead son than a gay son. And I just remember thinking about that for months. I'd already been thinking about writing a book, and I remember that death was really the one thing that like triggered me into thinking like I had been writing my story in bits and pieces for years as a journalist. And that moment was what let me know it was time to put our story out in the world. One, so that Black queer boys could feel seen, but two, so that people could understand that the narrative and notion around the Black community, you know, being more homophobic than others, although we do deal with homophobia, we do have narratives of really, really loving and strong community ties and community support and familial support like I had. And so that was really the catalyst for putting All Boys Are Blue out there, and making sure that it was young adult so that it could go into school systems and reach the people who needed it the most. As I always say, if these things happen to me at the age of 5 and at the age of 10 and at the age of 15, then kids who are 5 and 10 and 15, their guardians and also those children need to be able to read about those things. And so, yeah, that was really the catalyst for writing the book.
Thank you for sharing that. Leslie, our lovely state rep, Leslie, tell me how this book, and all of you panelists, tell me how this book spoke to you when you read it.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me and for curating this conversation. It's an honor to be here with such a prolific writer as well. You know, I think that what struck me was the authenticity. I mean, it was real, it was raw, it is, and it made me think about growing up, right? It made me think about my journey as a queer Black woman up until this day. And so I am excited that this book is out there in the world. I'm excited that young girls, boys, and gender binary folk have the ability to read this, right? And to see themselves in something so prolific. It's quite inspiring, actually. And I don't mean to be gushy because I'm not really known for that. So, but it was. I mean,
well, you're gushing, girl.
You know what I mean? Like the first damn chapter, I was like, dang, we got into it. You know what I mean? And so I want to thank you for that. And I just look forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Nathan, can you elaborate how this book spoke to you?
Yeah, you know, echoing everything everyone has said, I am gushy. So I'm gushy and mushy and sentimental. I'm a Pisces. And so, you know, I say this often about I read the book right before I formally met George. But after reading it, I said, I have to track George because we have mutual friends. I said, I have to track George down and tell them how much this book impacted me, because there are so many instances in this book that I can personally relate to my specific experience. But one thing about this book that is amazing to me is that even in its specificity, it is universal, right? We all go through rites of passage in trying to find our identity and trying to find ourselves as we grow up and what space we're going to occupy in this realm, right? And even though this is particularly a young Black queer boy's story, the universality of it is what spoke to me the most, because I thought that anyone reading this book could, relate to all of its references and all of the questioning and all of the, trying to figure it all out. And I just thought I had not read a book that, was that specific and universal at the same time, that spoke to my specific experiences, but then also universal experiences of growing up.
Thank you for that. That was very powerful. Thank you. Tariana, are you here? Or there you are. Same question for you, and then we'll get into some more. Tell us how what this book meant to you when you read it. Oh, I think Tariana is frozen. All right, so while she...
Well, first of all, George.
Oh. Tariana? Okay, we will come back to
Can
Tariana.
you hear?
Yeah, now we can.
I'm just
Go ahead.
going to
Oh, she's having technical difficulties.
This happens. Can you hear me okay?
Now we can hear you.
Hear you. It's like, welcome to Zoom world.
I know, right? Jesus. Are you there, Tariana?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I ended up just joining by phone. So
No problem.
there you have it. Well, first of all, George, I just want to thank you, because when I read the book, it felt both and it's, again, we're all now getting gushy, and that's not who I am either, but it just felt like an embrace. And even, I still remember, I think at the beginning of the book, and I wrote myself a note, you say, this book was crafted with care and love. And I felt that throughout the entire book, even when you were talking about just traumatic events, just the way that you brought your empathetic self, even through those times, it was just incredibly, incredibly touching. And especially as a mom, that was really special, just to see your full self. It just felt like you were sharing your true self with us. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
George, your family is such an important and positive part of your story. When you decided to write this book, what was that like for them and you?
It was interesting, I guess. Like, it was like, because I knew they would know certain things that I had been through, but I knew that there were certain things they just did not know that had happened. And it was tough, because while I guess the book was being written and all of these things were, reviews and, then the advanced reader copies come out, and then certain people start reading about it. My grandmother, who is the central, person to my family's life, she was diagnosed with a brain tumor right after I had turned the first draft in. And so, one, it made me have to change certain parts of the book, because it was terminal, we knew she wasn't going to be here when the book came out physically. And so it was a hard balance, because while we were being introduced to the world in this way, because anytime you write memoir, you're not just writing about yourself, you write about everybody else that's involved. We were introducing ourselves to the world while we were losing the biggest piece of our puzzle, right? Simultaneously, this was all happening. And so I just remember my Aunt Sarah specifically, when we were just I believe we were at a cookout or a baby shower. We were somewhere, and she just walked up to me and she just was like, listen, write the book. Don't worry about us. Like, we'll be fine, but you have to tell your truth. It has, nothing to do with us. And like, as a family, we've always gotten through it, and we will continue to get through it. And I think they could tell I was struggling with certain parts that I wanted to write, but wasn't sure, like, you don't want to embarrass your family or make your family feel like they're embarrassed, because this is going into the world in a major way. But again, as they always do, they just always operate from this space of worrying about us and us telling our story as authentically as possible. And so they made it really easy. And I think that's why the book it comes across as well as it does, because my family made it easy to tell the truth. And so, yeah, I'm just so fortunate that, again, I got to grow up in a family where I could write a book like this that has so many hard moments and heavy moments, and it just made us stronger. And so, you know, yeah.
And your family was supportive, and that's not always the case for people, and not necessarily just people of color, all people who want to come out. So, you know, that's amazing that your family was so supportive of this. And I think that this book will help a lot of young people who are struggling and whose families aren't supportive to have that inner strength. Leslie, when you, I don't know when you realized that you were queer, but so how did your family, do you mind sharing that story? Like, how did they react to you coming out, and how did you navigate in that space as a woman and as a Black woman?
Yeah. Well, first, I can't talk about my coming out story without talking about Erica, the student at Spelman College in Atlanta with her Southern accent and her freckles, who charmed me when she came to Boulder, and never left because in lesbian style, we U-hauled. But I just like fell in love with her. She was just amazing. And that wasn't when I knew I was queer. I had known before, but that's when I knew that I could actually be in a relationship with someone who was a woman, right? And that it could be so fulfilling and so whole and so real, just like I had heard about and seen on TV or whatever, but never heard or saw about it when it comes to a Black woman, right? Yeah. And so Erica, of course, was my first love. And we went through all of the things together, which is quite amazing. And one of those things was coming out to my mom. And as a Black woman, military, grew up in Oakland, always took us to San Francisco and to the Castro and all of that. I had anticipated that she would be quite accepting and open. And she was not at first. It was really hard for her because she thought that I was going to be put in harm's way, right? She thought being queer or being in same-sex relationships or being out with a partner who was non-traditional in her mind and out in the lifestyle, as of course she put it back then, was going to get me hurt, be it through intimate partner violence or hate crime. And I think as a woman of color, she said, you already have all of these things stacked against you. Why would you add something else? Like it was a choice, And I realized later on that was all fear, and all in love and wanting to protect me and ensure that I could live a full life and shine and have a great career and all of this stuff. But she had hoped that I would be different. And I remember too, because she said, but you were a cheerleader. I did everything right. And so later we laughed because I showed her the movie. And I was just like, she had a tough time. And I think the other thing that I realized later on, and we talked about a lot, was that she also felt like she was betrayed. She felt like I had been lying to her. And at the end of the day, I think that hurt her the most, So we went through a journey and we made it to the other side. And now she decides if she likes my partners based on if she likes them or not, which it ain't always smooth sailing still. But it ain't because of their sexual orientation or their gender expression or identity. It's truly about who she thinks is best for me and who will make me the happiest. And that's all you can ask for, right?
Absolutely.
So it's been a journey, but again, I'm glad to be here.
And so were there any books that could have helped you?
No.
So this would have been fabulous for you, George's book, right? There was
absolutely nothing. I mean, listen, my mom wouldn't let me go to Berkeley because she thought it would turn me gay. So I went to CU Boulder. She didn't know about CU Boulder. But I think there was no books, there was no lessons. And the interesting thing is my mom's best friend is bisexual. And we actually share the same birthday, which is all this like fascinating, and she's Black, all these fascinating things. So I know my mom's friend helped her through that, but I also think my mom's friend brought her fears into that because she couldn't be as open and authentic as she wanted to be. Honestly, one of the turning points was Ellen coming back on the scene. My mom liked her show, you know, and to this day, I think if I date someone and they wear a suit and tennis shoes, she's good, right? She's like, they're so cool. They're like Ellen. Like, it's very fascinating, you know. But there were no books. There was no guide, especially for Black queer folks. And, you know, I think, yes, this book absolutely would help, not only in our relationship, but with the rest of my family as well. You know, and we can get into this, but some of the stories remind me of my brother. I mean, you don't have to be queer, right? Or gender non-binary to identify with this book at all, you know? And so it's really for all of us.
Right. Right. Thank you for sharing that. Let me ask you one more question before I go to Nathan. So when you were younger, did you know that you were queer?
So it's funny. That's a funny question because I thought that was for white people.
Oh, wow.
So I didn't know. I just preferred to play with the girls and make out with them.
Oh.
And so I thought that's what it was. And I still thought I still wanted a boyfriend or whatever and all these different things, but I wasn't as interested in folks who were cisgender males, you know? And it probably wasn't until I saw folks who looked like me who were out that I realized I could be too. And that really wasn't until college. But like, I talked to my friends in high school and they were like, yeah, you were like leading the like make out sessions with the girls and everything. And I was like, well, I know, you know, I mean, I was a little doing my own thing, but I didn't know that meant I was queer, you know? I didn't know any of it. I just knew that I had an attraction to women, and I kind of thought maybe other folks did too. Like it wasn't that unique or different, because I still thought that I had to have a traditional relationship with a cisgender man in a house with a picket fence and a nice car, you know? So until I realized what I wanted out of my life, I had no idea what my partner would look like.
And was that a struggle? Because, you know, for George, he had that family support, but since you're, you know, it's like, how did you, and forgive my naivete, but like, how did you do that as a young woman, as a young girl? Like, how did you deal with your feelings? And like, was that hard?
It wasn't. Honestly, I thought I had gay people around me, mostly gay men, growing up, right? So it wasn't hard. And I didn't think it was really going to be that big of a deal. I didn't know my mom's friend was bisexual until college. And so, you know, then I had this whole thing, wait, were you guys together? Like, wait, what's really going on here? They weren't, but, you know, having all of these different thoughts. But as a child, because I didn't know it was anything different, and I, as a female cisgender female who presents very feminine, it wasn't an issue for me. I was still Leslie, the cheerleader, you know, who dressed cute and then also made out with girls sometimes. Like it wasn't a thing.
I had this visual of you in a cheerleading outfit making out with a girl behind the bleachers.
It was great. But in college, coming out and then going through that, it was a thing. And, you know, I had to make a very conscious decision about whether or not I was going to be out in the workplace as well. So it's like once I identified it and knew what I wanted out of my partner in my life, it was like, okay, now what? And as a person who presents the way that I do, I have to come out every day almost, you know? And so it's just like a constant thing. But I think the hardest part for me was really living in my truth and not being closeted when I entered into the workforce after college.
Thank you for sharing that story. That was great. And Nathan, same question for you. When did you realize that you were gay or different? And I don't want to use the word different. I mean it in just a very, you know, simple sense.
Yeah, you know, I was a 70s baby, an 80s kid, and a 90s teenager, right? So none of this was around, you know.
None of it.
Accessible. I mean, it was around, like you had Marlon Riggs, you had Essex, but I didn't know about any of that, right? I knew for sure when I was in kindergarten, because Jimmy McAndrews and I would sit with our hands on each other, you know, in the circle, in the little kindergarten circle. And I knew that I wanted to do that with Jimmy and not with Lisa, who wanted to do that with me.
Oh, wow.
I didn't have any, you know, language for it then. I think that, you know, my father's a Baptist preacher. And so that's a whole nother panel.
Yes.
And so growing up, my mother's side of the family they weren't overtly homophobic, right? And so they would say stuff, they would say stuff that was sort of offensive, but not like the full blown, they didn't use, the F word or anything like that. They didn't say that. They didn't talk about people for being gay. There were gay people in our world. One of my mother's favorite co-workers he actually worked for her, was a gay man that she loved. And I went over his house, and actually he was an alpha like George. And so, he put me in the alpha botillion and all that. So it was not, for my mother's side of the family, it was not that big of a deal. I think my mother, I know for now, for sure, my mother always knew, because your mother always knows. And then I had a boyfriend and a girlfriend at the same time in high school. And I'm still friends with both of them. One of them is my very best friend in the whole wide world, Andrea. And Bernard was my boyfriend. And I had a boyfriend and a girlfriend. I was just like, I think this is kind of how I'm going to be, right? And then when I was 16 years old, my father was making a joke about one of his pastor colleagues' son, who actually I've gone to high school with, who was now in college, and he joined the cheerleading team. And he just made the assumption, because he was a cheerleader, that he was gay. And it turns out he is actually not. He's now married with like 5 or 6 kids. And not that that means anything, but that he is not gay. And my dad just said, he turned to me, he said, if you were gay, I'd just shoot you. And he meant it. And that for me stunted my coming out process tremendously, right? And so, and then I got to college, and my mother found a letter I had written to, someone, a boy that I was seeing. And to make a long story short, we didn't talk about it then. I kind of flipped out because I wasn't ready. And, because my biggest fear growing up was that my mother would disown me. I really honestly didn't care about anybody else, but I just could not imagine going through life without my mom. My mom is she's my best friend. And then we revisited it. When I was 27, I wrote her a letter. I was practicing attorney in New York. I had been dating my partner at the time, Keith, for a year. And she read Keith's book. Keith has a book called One More River to Cross. His name is Keith Boykin. And she had read Keith's book, and she didn't tell me she had read the book. And so I wrote her the letter. She called me, and she was like, I just wanted you to know that I've just been waiting for you to be comfortable. I love you. You are a great son. And she said, and I read Keith's book. I'm presuming that that's your partner. And she said boyfriend. I think at the time we weren't using partner so widely then. And I said, he is. She said, but do you know how old he is? And that was her biggest thing, that he was 10 years older than me, and for the most part, aside from my father, my entire family embraced, when Keith and I ended our relationship 8 years into it, my grandmother and grandfather, it took them like 3 years to realize he wasn't coming to Thanksgiving anymore. And I'm like, they were like, is Keith coming? I'm like, no, he's not coming to Thanksgiving this year, y'all. He's probably not coming back. And I was, really blessed, like George was really blessed, that, my family embraced me. But there was no logo. There was none of that growing up. And so that's why I champion this book so much, and why I think it's so important for young people, not only the people that identify as queer or gay or lesbian or bisexual or all the rest of that alphabet and our rainbow, but also people who are allies and people who are trying to understand. And then more importantly, for people whose parents are dealing with children coming into their own identity. I think if my mother had All Boys Aren't Blue, I probably would have come out earlier. She would have been able to counsel me through it, because my mom's a social worker, and she would have had a better understanding of what I was going through. And I wouldn't have felt so alone in those teenage years. So that's why anytime I can talk about this book, anytime I can big up George, I'm gonna show up and do it, because I know it's a healing for so many people.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing your story. George, this needs to be in schools and required reading as far as I'm concerned. Is that part of your plans as well?
It is.
Am I speaking that into existence?
It is my hope and plan.
Good.
Do I feel that? I think one of the byproducts of the pandemic is that it couldn't roll out into schools traditionally because there were clearly, kids weren't in school. I think it is going to probably be something that's a lot of teachers are going to request to go in schools, but I'm pretty much preparing for one of the Bible, the Bible Belt states they already don't even like books that just discuss sex. Then sometimes they let you tiptoe the line if it's white sex, and then they let you tip a little further if it's white gay sex. I don't think we've had an instance yet of a book like mine going into a school system talking about Black queer sex. And so I think it should be in a lot of school systems. It already is in certain school systems in New Jersey, as well as in California. Because teachers will send me messages saying that they were able to get it. And I've done in New York as well, because I've done classroom visits in New York. So it is already starting to go into several states. Like I said, I think once we start to see what the Southern states, because there are definitely teachers who are definitely very pro-queer that try to push the envelope. But even Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give, I think, was banned in Texas at one point. So
yeah, it was, right.
I just can't see how, if we went from Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give to this, trying to go into a Texas school system, I think the inevitability is it being banned. And with the Equality Act being such major news currently, I think my book is going to be, it's hitting an interesting intersection of the country fighting for LGBTQ rights while this book is going international. And so I think I'll just leave it at that, and we will just see where the chips fall.
I hope it happens, because it's going to help a lot of people. It really will. And that brings me to you, Tariana. So you recently shared with me that your daughter identifies as bi. How was that for you? Did you know? And how are you and your husband navigating that? And has your daughter read the book yet, or is she's going to read this book?
Yes, she's going to read the book. And like it was mentioned, mothers know, right? Mothers know. And in our case, I observed that she was, I think, exploring again her identity when she started to, there was a stage that she really wanted to wear a lot of like masculine clothes. And she explored that. And I think, and then she got over that. But I think we as a family, my husband is a defense attorney. I work in equity. So conversations about the marginalized are everyday conversations at home. And they are very used. Both my son and my daughter, they both have disabilities. So it's very much part of who we are. And I think what I feel very lucky is that when she was ready to share her truth with us, it did not come from a nervous or place of fear. I was very proud that it was a declaration. It was a kind of claiming her identity. And I think she just told us, she said, well, I'm bi. And we just looked at her and going, okay. And then we just kept having dinner, right? And I think she just smiled. And then it just became something that it was not a big deal. It's just another part of who she is. It was another, like George says, it's another piece, right? Not the full human. And we were able to see the full human. What was interesting, though, is that she had a number of friends who were incredibly fearful about coming out to their parents. And what would happen is I would be driving them right in the back seat, and she would tell them, that no matter what, if you come out to your parents and they ask you to leave, you can always come to our house. And for me, again, that touched me, because she felt absolutely comfortable, saying, we will embrace you, we will love you. And so I think I feel very lucky that she, again, navigated this from a place of acceptance, understanding, and pride. Again,
Right.
it was a declaration. Having said that, they're not books, right? She had to navigate this on her own. And I'm lucky again that she was in an environment that she felt accepted. But
Well, bravo to you and your husband. That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. So Leslie, you are the first African-American openly LGBTQ person elected in Colorado. Do you feel the weight of that on your shoulders? And how are you trying to show up for that community, being a woman and being Black? Because I know for me, being an African-American and being a woman, I always feel like I have to, be the best and just really, put my best foot forward. Are you going through that?
When I was first elected, absolutely. And when I was running, absolutely. But now I'm proud to say that I've brought folks alongside me, so I'm not the only Black queer person.
That's right.
But I was very supported by the Black political community as a queer person, because I had always been a queer person to them. And I did the work in Black churches. I had to have very open conversations about the fact that I exist both in a queer space and a Black space. And so when I ran for office, when the little whisper campaign about me being gay started up by my opponent's campaign, the Black pastors were like, we know, and she's still ours, Doesn't mean they didn't have their own journey and aren't still going through their own journeys, but that's what the response was. And for so many folks out here in Northeast Denver, that's what it was. Like, we appreciate all of who she is and we know who she is, right? All of me. And that's what we want out of an elected official. But being elected as the first, there was definitely a lot of weight, and because I know that there were some other queer African-American electeds who could not be out, and so I did have that weight, but I kind of let that go, because what I've realized was that in order for me to be good at my job, I needed to not have apprehension about who I was, not just being out, but being a certain kind of way for everybody, that's what's really important. And so what I find is that people find out that I'm queer, and I tell them, and especially when I speak to young folks, I talk about it, and then I go to the work that I'm doing, because I want them to know that there's not one type of queer person. There's not one type of elected official, and I'm never going to be a white cisgender man. And so here's who I am, and here's how I'm going to stand in this space. I look forward to seeing how this next generation stands in this space as well as who they are.
Right.
And so, yes, you have to be in a room a certain way. Yes, you have to represent a certain way. But I find all of that was just a little bit too much for me to carry alongside of the journey that I find to be still like my root identity, which is as a Black woman. I mean, for me, being Black comes first, and we have so much work to do that if I hold on to something that's not mine, I'm not going to be able to get that work done, And so that's what's really important to me. And I just want to come back to something that George said about being in the schools. I mean, you might be in the schools, you might not, but people will find your book, right? People will learn about you, and maybe they'll learn about me too. Maybe they'll learn about Stephanie. Maybe they'll learn about this conversation, because it's much easier to do so. And that's what's going to really make folks feel supported and able to be whoever the heck they are, I mean, that must be a weight for you as well, but it's an honor. I'm assuming it's such an honor to know that someone is going to decide that their life is worth living because they read your book.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what I want people to take away. The recent news from the Vatican was so disheartening and so backward. And I read something online that the suicide lines lit up after that announcement came out. And I was thinking, my God, if they could only read George's book, or if they could only, be able to talk to somebody about what they're going through and know that they're not alone, it could help them. So George, I don't even think you know how important your book really is. Like, you do know, but I'm just saying, like, it's so important to get this book into not even just Black males, but everyone who identifies as gay, queer, or whatever. They need to read this book, because they need to know that they're not alone, and there's a community that will support and love them. So I really can't tell you enough how, and I'm gushing now, and I don't gush, but you know, thank you for doing this. Really, thank you so much. But Leslie, one more question for you. So how do you think Denver's doing well, or Colorado, I'll say, is doing well for young kids? And what can they improve on for kids who identify as LGBTQ?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because we have passed the laws that a lot of folks, want to pass, and we've made that progress. Some schools are more open than others.
Right.
But are we doing enough for our young people? Absolutely not.
Mhm.
Queer kids and queer kids of color and kids of color are more likely to be suspended and expelled still for the same behavior, right? Schools still excuse someone who's been called the F word maybe over and over and over again. They say, well, just act different and you won't get teased, So these things are still happening, and we absolutely have to do more. Is Colorado a good place to be for queer people? As good as anywhere, I guess. You know what I mean? We have the laws, we have some of the protections, but I can't say that a kid down the street is not struggling, with their identity, or with how someone's treating them, or how someone is or not seeing them. I think we have to do more, but Stephanie, the thing that I think we need to be doing is hosting more of these conversations. Seeing someone like you, step up and use, your space to convene these conversations. Kids are watching this and saying, wait a minute, Steph's like my mom. Maybe he could be cool. You know what I mean? Or like, maybe
I try to be a cool mom. My kids don't think I'm cool.
No, they don't. But you are. And so I think just having really the questions you ask, I think are really important. And I think that some folks might be, oh, well, I don't know if I should ask this or not because it seems so basic or whatever. No. The questions you ask are the questions that a lot of people are struggling with right now, especially if they have a young person coming out, or especially if they want to be a true ally and champion of these issues. And so having your perspective in this conversation and having these types of conversations, I believe is what really, really will move the needle, not some law that I can write,
I thank you for that. And I hear you. I yes, thank you for that. I do. Thank you. George, so blue means a lot of things and all boys aren't blue. Can you elaborate on them, please?
Sure, if I can remember them.
Oh, you remember.
No, I remember them. So I think the first is the most obvious, which is all boys aren't blue, which is just kind of a nod to the whole gender reveal trend. It just seemed, in my opinion, like as more people started to identify as queer, it seemed like heterosexuals' pushback was to determine the baby's gender even earlier than the baby shower. And so it's like the pre-utero determination of who this baby is supposed to be without actually waiting to see what the baby turns out to be. And so that's kind of the first nod to it, because interestingly enough, I mean, I don't say it in the story, but it's like, clearly, if you read the story, my mother didn't want to know what I was. And so that's why the whole fiasco happened with my aunt running out the room saying it's a girl, and then having to run back in and then run back out saying it's a boy, it's a boy. And then I turned out to be this. And so it didn't matter anyway. And so I think that's what the first blue just kind of pays a nod to. It's like, whether the color is blue or pink, you really don't know until the child naturally or innately shows you who they are when they, and tells you who they are. The other blue, my dad was a cop, so I grew up in what would be considered like a blue family. But it was interesting because my dad was the president of the Black cops. And so like the Black cops in our city had their own separate committee, I guess you would say, that was called Ebony. And my dad was a president, so they used to meet at our house. And so, monthly there would be 20, 30 Black cops downstairs at the bar, so I had a different relationship with the police in my city. But it doesn't stop the relationship that you have with policing and with police when you leave your city. And so that was always like an interesting space to live in, to go to middle school where they had cops in the middle school, but all of the cops in the middle school knew who I was because they knew who my dad was, because my dad was their boss. And then to go to Catholic school and know that police at the Catholic school that I went to didn't know my dad, and anything I did there was viewed much differently and much more harshly. And so that's the second blue. The third blue is paying homage to Moonlight by Terrell Alvin McCraney. He is a dear, dear, dear friend who throughout from the beginning of the book process, he was one of the first people I talked to when I said I wanted to write the book, and gave me so much advice up until maybe 2 weeks ago, helping me through certain situations of learning the business of Hollywood now that the book's being turned into a TV show. But his story of Moonlight, which originally was a play called Black Boys Look Blue in Moonlight, it opened the door. A byproduct of that movie was the fact that it greenlit more queer authors to be able to write, to do more storytelling. Even though we still haven't seen it projected yet on the television screen, it is now allowing us to adapt these books into things for television. And like I said, that's the byproduct of something that he created. And then the fourth blue just refers to the character of Blue from Queen Sugar, which I just don't think it's talked about enough how, and again, I have no idea whose idea that was to come up with that storyline of this boy that had this doll that wasn't a problem until he started to get a little bit older. And then you started to see how the family started to question, like, okay, well, at first we just thought it was, okay, a boy, okay, that's fine. He likes this doll. But as Blue started getting older and still liked the doll and needed the doll, and the doll was a security blanket, you saw how people's opinions of Blue started to change. The questioning of Blue's queerness started to happen. But you also saw how supportive his father was, because his father had an experience where he went to high school with a trans student, and so that he used to protect. And so I just thought that narrative around like Blue and that whole storyline was just something I had never seen done on television before. And I just think it was just so interesting that it doesn't get talked about enough. But I think like the character of who Blue is just spoke volumes about the character of who I am and boys that are not blue. So yeah. Wow,
that's great. that was not what I was expecting. That's good. That's a good segue to you, Nathan. So Nathan, so the narrative piece that you directed for George on the book, tell me how that came to be. It was absolutely fantastic. And if you haven't had a chance to see it, I will, send it to everyone. It is beautiful.
Thank you so much. Well, as I mentioned before, I just finished reading the book, and I said just to the universe, I gotta meet George like directly and just applaud the effort of the book and just explain how much I really loved it and how much I related to it. And then almost like clockwork, because that's what happens with the universe, right? Yep. I got a call from Amara Kennedy at AHF, AIDS Healthcare Foundation, who is in charge of Black, and I forget the Black Leadership AIDS
Crisis Coalition.
AIDS Crisis Coalition. I'm getting older, so
I got COVID brain too, don't worry about it.
But I was having senior moments at 18, so I can't even really blame it on aging. But Amara and George called me, and they said that they had this idea about doing a dramatic reading of 3 chapters from the book for National Black HIV/AIDS Awareness Day, which was February 7th. And would I, consider directing it? And I was like, yeah, I literally just finished reading the book, and I literally just said I had to get in touch with George. And I think probably, I can't speak for them, but probably what they had in mind and what my vision started doing, I was like, we're gonna make this a film. This is a film. This is not just, your typical dramatic reading. We really wanted to make it something that was timely and timeless. Mm-hmm. And we recruited some amazing actors. First, my heart, my love, Jennifer Lewis. Jennifer did a movie. She did my film Dirty Laundry, and this is when I was a producer back in the day. And we have been, family, since 2006. And so it just so happens coincidentally. George was like, well, the person that I would always thought would play my nanny would be Jennifer Lewis. I said, well, that's easy. That's my girl. And so we can, so Jennifer Lewis, Delon Burnside from Pose, Thomas Hobson from Sherman Showcase, Bernard David Jones from Uncorked. We had this amazing cast, and they kind of let me do my thing. And as George and I were talking about when we were in the green room, you know, that was like the end of November. So it was like right after Thanksgiving or right before Thanksgiving. And we went into production January 7th. And so, you know, and then the film premiered February 7th. So
wow.
As my producing partner, Richard Pelzer, says, we did like 6 months worth of work in like 5 weeks. So it was a daily process. But I mean, I know a lot of people say this, filmmakers say this, but it literally was seamless, even though we were doing this in the height of the pandemic.
COVID, right.
Height of COVID.
Wow.
And so everyone, you know, everyone had to be multiple tested, and you know, and we still pulled it off. And I really wanted to, with the film, create an environment where we showcase contemporary African-American art, because I felt like George's words were so artistic and so poetic and so raw. And then we got these wonderful performances. It was really a wonderful project. So I'm just excited for more people, and we're trying to get it out there to more people to see it and experience it.
We'll push it out too.
Often, everybody doesn't learn from reading, right? So, you know, television and film, I know for a firm fact that they have a way of creating empathy and sharing stories that other mediums just don't. And so we're trying to make sure that so many people see this film. And then also when George and Gabrielle Union finish developing the show, that when the show comes on, that everyone tunes in and we make it a huge hit.
Yay, and you must premiere it on the Vineyard, George, please. I'm telling you right now.
And I might have to say that Gabrielle Union was probably my first crush. It's either her or Dina, but bring it on with everything. Huh?
I still have a crush on her.
Right? I mean, I should be
bad to the bone.
Like the whole family is amazing.
Yes.
I want to switch gears a little bit, because the book also deals with intersectionality. And even though I don't identify as gay or queer, I do want to talk about navigating in certain spaces. So Tariana, you grew up in Puerto Rico, is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, you grew up in Puerto Rico, and that's such a different space from the United States, because here in the US, you're more brown than you are in Puerto Rico, right?
Yeah.
So tell me, how do you navigate that? How do you deal with that?
Well, I tell the story that I didn't realize I was brown until I moved to the States, you know, 26, 27 years ago. And that was shocking in a way. I tell the story that I was in high school. My dad was doing a sabbatical in Gainesville, Florida. And my first day of school, I walked into a music room for music class, and it was in the round. And all the white kids were sitting in one side of the room, and all the black kids were sitting on the other side of the room. And there I stood, not knowing where I belonged. And I ended up sitting by myself in the middle. And so I think for me, obviously in Puerto Rico, then I was the majority, right? And when I came to the States, it became, you know, really evident that I was the other. And I think when I look at intersectionality too, you know, there's a quote that from the book that George talked about how trauma brings people together. And I think in spaces, you know, so many times, you know, we are the ones in the room, right? We are the only ones in the room, that when we walk in different spaces, I mean, something I immediately do, and it's just gut, right, is I look around to see, you know, where are my Black and brown people? And, you know, it's that sense of safety. So I think that it's obviously it's part of who I am. I do have to say that I also see parallels in terms of Black culture and Latino culture with regards to, you know, attitudes about LGBTQ plus, as well as mental health. You know, you've heard about machismo, right? So there is, right, this idea, right, that of manliness or, you know, masculinity, and how that is absolutely opposite, right, to queerness or being gay. And that's a hard word to navigate. And the same thing about the stigma around mental health, which of course for LGBTQ, especially young people, right, is something that is critical. So I think, right, it's that intersectionality. I feel like Leslie's comment about I'm Black, right, first. I'm a Black woman. And that's how I show up. I'm a Latina woman. But for me, the connection is that a big part of my identity is as a mother. And for me is, when we are in the spaces and you navigate and think about the risk of showing up, for me, I'm not just an ally, I'm an advocate for my children. Both have disabilities. My daughter identifies as bi. So in every space, right, I come in ready to love and accept, and ready to slay if necessary, for me, for my children, and for others.
And George, you talk about not being Black enough, not being whatever. And, can you elaborate on that? Like, what was it that made you feel that you weren't Black enough? Because I've had that experience where I didn't think, I always knew I was Black, but, you get, once you open your mouth, you get stereotyped, right? So I can remember working in the music industry, and, I was an assistant back then. I would answer the phone, and my boss's people would come to visit him, and they're like, "Oh, you're not what I thought you were going to be." Meaning, "Oh, I didn't know you were Black. I thought you were going to be a little white girl." And I'm always like, "Well, what the hell do you think I was going to be? I'm just Stephanie." And then dealing with people who are Black, and then them saying, Stephanie's not Black enough. She's, because my experience wasn't one of strife and one of, I just didn't have that experience. It was, my family came from, upper middle class family, and I just didn't have the struggle that some African Americans had. I was put into a box of other. So George, if you can sort of talk about your feelings with that and how you came to terms with it, and you, Leslie and Nathan, you too, if that's happened to you.
Yeah, I mean, my name is George Matthew Johnson, so. Same thing, like the older I got, people assumed who I was over the phone, or assumed who you are, and then you show up and you could see on their face.
Right on their face, right? Right on their face.
You really could see it on their face. They didn't realize that you were going to be Black. But I think before that, when you are queer, there's a reduction of your Blackness, because to many, queer is two things: the effeminization of man, but people also did really think that queerness is a white person's thing. And so if you even present remotely effeminate, they reduce your Blackness. If you even present remotely too queer, they reduce your Blackness. And so again, I never had an issue, so to speak, where what's the best way to say it? So there were Black kids that ran to white kids. Like in my school, there were certain Black kids who wanted the white kids to be a part of the clique, and I never wanted that. So that type of rejection never bothered me. But the one thing that I did face was, again, when you are only around Black people, they begin to other you, right? And so it's like you walk in a room of only Black people, the next thing they do is they start to dissect, okay, well, man, woman, tall, short.
That's so true.
Darker skin,
right?
Lighter skin, and they start to pick you apart. But those identifiers don't tend to reduce your Blackness. But if they feel that you are queer, it's an automatic reduction of like, well, you don't even belong in the community, period. And so that's really what it was. And again, I feel like because Blackness is inherently queer, because Black queer people exist, if I can't walk in any space and exist fully as I am, then it's a reduction to me feeling like I can be a full Black person. And so I think that's really what I was speaking to in the book, was that at times I couldn't be my fullest Blackest self. And especially when you think about who creates culture, it is Black queer people. It is Black people from ballroom scene. It is Black. It is like the creators and the orchestrators. You think about the Black gay men who were the writers, or the Black queer women like Audre Lorde who were, when you think about Nika Giovanni, like the list just goes on of like who our greats were that curated the culture, from fashion to how we move to all of the things. Yet we're the people who are least accepted in all of the spaces, or at least allowed to even enjoy those spaces. Or as you see with like the co-opting of our language, which I think is the biggest issue that we have.
Absolutely,
Our
absolutely.
language still is co-opted. Queer language, like every time you see new lingo, it is a queer person that more likely than not started it.
And a Black queer person at that.
Right. Just like the where the money reside. That, I mean, when you think about that, everybody is saying it, but if he were to walk into a mainly heterosexual space that was Black, he would not be accepted, even though most of those Black people know where the saying came from and probably have said the saying, right? And it always makes me laugh when people quote Baldwin, like homophobes who quote James Baldwin. It's like they don't even have a clue.
Interesting.
Like they just don't even have a clue. But yeah, I mean, that's really all I'm speaking to is like, you know, realistically, as a Black queer person, there are times where I can't show up fully as myself without a safety issue. And so it's just a determination of, do I want to, is it my safety versus my happiness? And most times I go with my happiness, and, you know, it doesn't mean that I won't get stares because I'm in stretched jeans or because I have on makeup or because I have on some clothes that are too femme or my nails are done, or it's always a caveat of things. But yeah, it really is a choice of safety versus happiness a lot of times in the spaces that we go in. And it's a reduction of our Blackness because we can't fully be in all Black spaces without safety.
And I'm going to have to jump off, but I just wanted to lift that up and to also acknowledge that when I say I show up as a Black woman first, that's a privilege.
Absolutely.
You know, and to be cisgendered is a privilege. And I don't think that people really understand that, especially when we talk about intersectionality, you know? And so I have been able to walk in this world in that way. And while I don't want to become invisible, I could not talk about it. You know, I could just not talk about it and see what happens. But that's not moving the needle. That's not making progress. And so again, I think that these conversations are extremely important. I think that our allies and champions are equally as important and need to be a part of this conversation. And I mean, I'm about to go on and order like 10 books so that I could just like hand them out, because everyone needs to be a part of this and to see what, you know, your experience looks like through your eyes, George. And just thank you for including me in this conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, Leslie. I know you got to go. And we're going to wrap this up pretty quick. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Someone has a question for you, George. George, can you speak to the multiplicity of messages within the message that is shared through this book? Was that intentional or a ripple effect of the stories being shared?
The multiplicity of messages within the message of the book. I would have to say
right there.
Not, because I am a Scorpio, that it was intentional. Because I think about everything. Like I've already thought 5 years ahead. I've already thought like, look, Nathan don't even know. I've already submitted the next book that's coming out in September to Sony. I've already told them we want to do another dramatic read. Like, you know what I mean? Like I'm already like, that's just my brain, right? And honestly, like again, I will say like I was fortunate enough to have someone like Terrell McCraney, who literally, when I was like, I'm gonna write the book, the first thing he asked, he was like, well, do you want it to be on TV? I said, yes. He said, then you need to write it like a TV show. And that was like, he was like, you can't just write it. Like, you got to think, what do you want this project to be? And so the multiplicity of messages was hyper intentional, because I knew the storytelling was going to be fun. Like the storytelling I knew, but the messages within the certain stories, and that's how you choose the stories. And I'm just a person who has always liked to connect the dots, you know, from slavery till today, right? There's a connection between something that happened to a slave in 1767 is something that is a byproduct of that is still happening today in 2021. But it's about, are we connecting those dots? And so, yes, very intentional when I'm layering my messages within stories. And hopefully you'll see the growth of that with the next book, because we took it up a notch.
Okay, this is for you, Tariana. What does Tariana mean by referencing both my children have disabilities, with her daughter being bisexual? Please explain the terms.
Well, in the context of what I presented, I was talking about how, you know, my identity. And when I think about who I am and how I identify, you know, I am a Latina woman. I'm a wife, right? But I cannot separate. I'm a mother. Right. So in all the spaces that I am, that's not something on the side. I'm a mother, and I'm very conscious. It's very real to me that I'm also a mother that has children that have to navigate the world through these different intersectionalities, as young people that are identified, are BIPOC, as young people that have disabilities, and my daughter, identifying as bi. So for me, is I show up in spaces, not just as myself in terms of my identity, but the role I play, not just as an ally, but as an advocate. And that's not something that I can, separate. It's who I am and it's part of who I am. So that's what I meant. It's like all of those layers, all of that intersectionality of my children is something I carry, and that I'm incredibly proud of, that I celebrate. We talk about, we don't want to just be tolerated, right? When we talk about tolerance, we want to be celebrated, right? And for me, is I celebrate that about my children, and I will also for others, right? I celebrate and embrace people that I know live a life of, in the margins. And I mention also that I also will slay, because that's how I show up as well. And I do it for my children and I do it for others.
All right, and there's one more question. This is for the people on the panel who identify as queer or gay. Can you please explain the letters, and is this something new? I actually had this question myself too, but it's such a sticky question to ask, so thank you for asking this question. They want to know, is this something new beyond lesbian, bisexual, gay? The other letters, where is this coming from? Is this something that has been around forever that just didn't have a name for it, or is this trendy?
So I'll come
and
from
this is a heterosexual asking, and myself as well, and never to offend, but just curious.
I'll come from a bit of an older perspective. So, when I was growing up, there was just gay, lesbian, bisexual.
Right.
Even though we knew transgender people were out there, that it was not an inclusive community. Even the gay community was not inclusive.
Oh, wow.
And so as we became more, as the gay community in general became more, or tried to become more inclusive, we added different letters, right? Because we realized that there's a spectrum of identity, right, along the queer spectrum. I remember we actually have had a talk about this. I remember when I was growing up, the word queer was actually offensive. And the word gay was actually the preferred, or homosexual was the preferred thing to say. But if you call somebody queer or whatever, or any of the other derogatory terms, it was viewed as negatively. What I love about the younger generation, in terms of them embracing all of the letters of the alphabet in the rainbow alphabet, is that they refuse to be defined by anything, and they refuse to limit their identity just to a nomenclature or some kind of label, right? And I love that. And so queer has now become the term of art. Younger people prefer that word because it encompasses all of those letters. And for people like me, I'm 45, it's been an adjustment, because now we're coming in, they're such great crusaders, and I love it. They are out there. They are making sure that we are heard in such a bold and wonderful way that we kind of are like, okay, we get it. Queer, let's go with it. Let's co-opt the term back, and it's kind of, it's kind of one of those things. Is like, let's take our power back and define ourselves how we are. And so I love that this younger generation, is showing up exactly as they are. And so if it is a non-binary person, or a gay person, or a queer person, or the intersex person, or transgender person, they're not limited to any kind of label that was, prevalent back when I was coming up. And I love it. I think it's revolutionary. I think it's powerful. But I also give grace, because even within our community, it's a conversation that's going on. It's a dialogue and a learning that's going on. And I think if you ask anyone over 40 the same question, and you ask someone under 40, you may get completely different answers, which I think is beautiful too.
I think revolutionary is a great word. Thank you for sharing that. So this is not a fad then. This is it. This is here to stay. And maybe more letters.
It's a movement towards inclusivity.
It's a movement.
And inclusivity in a way that you don't have to be defined by other people's definitions of you. You get to define yourself as you are. If you are a man and you identify as a man and you identify as queer, you can carry a purse if you want to. And you can get your nails done. You know what I mean? You can, and that you show up as Nathan or George or Stephanie or Tariana, and not as a label that society wants to pigeonhole you and put you in. I think it's brilliant.
Yes. What were you going to say?
I mean, it's an ode, right, to living your truth. And I think George says that in the book, right? That the book is a gateway for people to find their truth and the power to live in that truth. And I think that's what we're seeing, right? That this, which is magical, truly.
Yeah, because, and, you know, I always say realistically, it's like these terms, even though we didn't have terms for them, these people have always existed. Like we have as a people have always existed, we just didn't have terms. And so now that we can name these things, I just feel like we're in a phase of expansion until we can destroy it all. Because it's like, I think at the end of the day, the ultimate goal is to get to a place where gender doesn't matter and sexuality doesn't matter. Like, because those things shouldn't other anybody, because it shouldn't really matter at the end of the day, right? Like, and I say that to say, like, just because someone, literally, just because a doctor says it's a girl and they mark girl, that means you're going to make less money throughout your life.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's
because we all know the wealth gap, the equity gap, but we never think about it from, like, we think of it from a space of when you are an adult. And it's like, well, no, that started when a doctor said you were a girl. Right. That's where the equity gap starts, because at birth, if you were twins and the doctor said, well, you're a girl or you're a boy, that means you're going to make 70% to the dollar that your brother makes, simply because the doctor said you were a girl and you were a boy. And it's like, that's what we're trying to abolish when we talk about like the terms and like why we're so expansive and why we're trying to do that. Is realistically, one, we want to acknowledge, hey, all of these things exist. And so now it's so big, now it doesn't really matter if any of it exists. And that's really the ultimate goal for us. Is to abolish it all, because no one should have to go down a pathway simply because people are labeling them boy or girl at birth. And and then that's really what it is. And intersex, which is the I that's in there, it replaced the term hermaphrodite, because hermaphrodite actually was never correct. Like if you read what a hermaphrodite was, it's actually not what doctors used it for. So intersex is actually the term that replaced that.
And I want to say something else too, and giving George another applause, is that, you know, throughout the process of making this film, I learned so much. I was educated, you know, because I think people don't understand that even within our own community, we're educating each other, right?
Absolutely.
And in that space, and so like you were like asking the question and you wanted to know the answer. In that space, I think that we always have to remember is to show some grace, right? And especially for people who are coming at you with a question from a sincere, wanting to understand and be empathetic and compassionate and show some grace. And across the board, George showed grace in terms of the way, because it was a brain switch, you know, in terms of saying they, them. And it taught me a lot. And now my brain has switched, but in the process, George was very gracious with all of us in terms of, you know, understanding what it meant to be non-binary and why it was important to address them as them and not him. And then also about their transition over the couple of years, because when George wrote the book, the pronouns were still he, him.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and so it was just this whole learning, and it was wonderful, because if you're really open, if you're really coming to the table to understand someone else, then you really have to listen to what they're telling you they are.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, George, because when I look at your book, there's he in there instead of they. Is that because and my question is that because the publishing industry doesn't feel that people will understand that and it's easier to say he or she, or why did they do that?
Yeah, no, that was me who did it, because at the time when I wrote the book, I went by he, but at the time of who I was as a child, I was a he, like, and that was what I went by. And so it just made sense. I wanted to write, and I wrote the book from the space of the language I had at the time, not the language I have now. So,
Interesting.
because in the chapter where I write about hope, I write from the language I had then, which a lot of people were like, that's interesting, because we know if I would have wrote it correctly, quote unquote, with the language, the dead naming, the terminology I have now, it wouldn't have been the powerful chapter it needed to be.
Right.
It needed to be written from who I was then, and people needed to understand what it was like for me as a young boy watching my cousin transition and knowing what her former name was, and knowing the mix up, and knowing how we were trying to, but I could have sanitized it, because I know all of the lingo and all of the right ways to say it now. But the book was very intentional in that choice. And but I always felt like a they, them my whole life. I just went by he, him, because I just wasn't ready. That changed because of a conversation I had with my grandmother before she passed. But I talk about that final conversation, one of the final conversations we have in the next book. And so, yeah, that was the reason that it changed, though.
Okay, thank you. That was one of my questions. And one last question for all of you. So is there a divide within this community with race, with whites, Asians, Latinos, I don't know, Native Americans? Is there sort of like a hierarchy, so to say? Wrong word, but you know what I mean. Class structure, is that right?
It echoes the main society.
The main society is the exact same cascade.
Is that right?
Exact same. I live in Los Angeles, and the predominantly gay area is called West Hollywood. And if you are anything other than white or some Asian and some Latino, a Latina, you're not really welcome there, and you feel it. You feel it. And this isn't 20, I mean, we can't go nowhere now, but you feel it in that space. If you are Black and queer, you don't feel comfortable, you don't feel welcome. And I lived in New York for 15 years where we have our own community, we have our own thing. And it was also that we built it out of necessity, because racism is strong and rampant in the white gay community. And which is the craziest thing to me, because Nikki Giovanni says nothing is the same except for oppression and shame, right? So an oppressed group turning around and oppressing another oppressed group just does not make psychological sense, except for the fact that we're in a society where there's totem poles. I think there's a totem pole, right? And people are very much aware of that. And so, and white gay men are uniquely, keenly aware of that.
Yeah.
And they use that power to subvert other races within the community. It's a big deal. And it's really, really sad. And I always said, to growing up, one of the reasons why I really resisted coming out and where I really, really, really wanted to like women more than I did was because, on this totem pole, the Black men are at the bottom, and then there's one more rung for Black gay men. Wow. And it didn't matter if, the Black man had been to prison or did something bad or whatever, as long as he wasn't gay. It was like we were the last rung on this totem pole. But we're changing that with books like this, with projects like this, with conversations like this. But yes, indeed, racism is rampant and running wild within the gay community, and it's a problem.
That's disheartening. I can't even, that's sad. Wow, I don't even know what else to say about that. That's really disheartening to hear. Okay, well, we are way over an hour. I want to thank all of you for coming and doing this conversation. I hope I made you proud. This is one of the hardest ones I've ever done, because this is not, I don't identify, and I'm like, I don't want to mess this up and say anything, offensive. So thank you for giving me and allowing me to ask these questions. George, one final thing from you. What do you want people to take away from this book?
Oh man. I think it changes each time somebody asks, like, what is the takeaway? I think from a year ago, we're almost a year in, at this point, the takeaway, I think the takeaway for me now is, the story has always existed It's just always been denied. And so I'm not the first person to tell the story. I'm just the first person that they allowed to tell it. And so that's the biggest takeaway to come from this, is that even though you're reading this in 2021, there was a student next to you in 1975 that felt the same way as me. And there was a student next to you in 1935, and there was a slave on a slave field in 1765. That was me. And that's honestly the takeaway. They all had this story. And I'm interested enough, I'm working on a project around slavery. And so that's the hardest thing to find, is like any written work by queer slaves, but it's like, I know they were there, right? So again, that's the takeaway from this book, is that I just was the first to allow to tell this story, but I'm just telling the story that the other writers didn't get a chance to tell.
And thank you for telling your story. Thank you very much. Thank you, George. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Tariana. Thank you, Tattered Cover. Please, everyone, buy this book from Tattered Cover, a local bookstore. Thank you, Tariana, Denver Arts and Venue, for always being an ally to people of color and the lGBTQIA community. We definitely salute you, Tariana. And I wish you nothing but success, George. I really do. I wish you nothing but success and love and light. It was very brave of you to write this book, and I'm glad that you did. And I see nothing but goodness in your future. And we're gonna bring you to Martha's Vineyard so we can have this conversation in front of an audience. And Nathan, I can't wait to see some more great projects that you do. You're an amazing filmmaker. 90 Days, the film you had at our festival, was beautiful, beautiful. I would send you a link, Tariana. And I wish you nothing but success.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You did great. This was awesome. That's how you do it. That's how it's done.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Good night.
Good night.